There were others who couldn't move on. Servants who had worked in the palace swore they still heard his voice at night. Some claimed that the torches in the lower halls flickered without wind, as if something unseen passed by. A few even believed he was reborn, that gods don't die but change faces. Within months, cheap street prophets began claiming to speak for the spirit of Gaius. They predicted floods, plagues, divine retribution. It was madness repeating itself in miniature. The shadow of a dead emperor stretching beyond the grave in the countryside. Peasants told stories to frighten children of the golden ghost, an emperor who rode through the night searching for his lost crown. Mothers whispered that if a child lied, Caligula would come in dreams to demand the truth. The tales grew wilder with each telling, but at their heart was something true. Rome had not killed Caligula. It had absorbed him. His rule had taught the empire what fear could accomplish, and that knowledge could not be buried. Years later, when historians wrote of his reign, they argued over whether he had been insane or simply cruel. Some called him a madman, others a genius of manipulation. But the people who had lived through it knew the truth. He was both. His madness was not random. It was methodical, deliberate, and contagious. The empire learned from him how to weaponize fear. Future emperors would perfect what he began, hiding it behind new words: order, unity, destiny. And Rome, unable to see the infection spreading, would celebrate each successor as a savior until the cycle began again. The damnation of memory failed. You can destroy statues, melt coins, and silence poets, but you cannot erase the shape of terror once it has been carved into the human heart. Caligula had shown the world that power need not be justified when it can be performed, that cruelty can masquerade as divinity, and that the applause of the terrified sounds no different from the praise of the faithful. The Senate tried to cleanse Rome's conscience, but deep down, they all knew the empire's soul still belonged to him. Centuries have passed since Caligula's ashes turned to dust, yet the echo of his reign never truly faded. Empires rose and fell, languages changed, gods were forgotten, but the shadow of his lesson remained. The lesson that power, once fed by fear, doesn't need faith to survive. It only needs memory. And Rome remembered, even when it pretended to forget. His name was carved out of marble, but the idea of him, the system he created, lingered like smoke that clings to stone. The empire learned that obedience could be dressed as devotion, and cruelty disguised as order. Caligula had built not just a tyranny, but a manual for it. Historians centuries later would argue over what truly drove him: madness, trauma, or divine delusion. But the deeper truth lies not in the man, but in those who let him rule. Every empire creates its monsters, and every monster learns from the silence of the crowd. Caligula didn't invent terror. He perfected it by making people complicit. The senators who applauded him, the guards who obeyed, the citizens who looked away, they all became bricks in the structure of his power. That was his greatest cruelty. He didn't just make victims, he made accomplices. Rome moved on. The empire continued to expand, conquering new lands under new emperors. Claudius rebuilt what his nephew had ruined, and under his reign, the city began to breathe again. But something invisible had changed. Fear had been institutionalized. Loyalty was measured not by love of Rome, but by the ability to stay silent. The machinery Caligula built, the reports, the decrees, the surveillance of conscience, was never dismantled. It was refined, polished, made efficient. The horrors of one man became the habits of a state. Over time, stories about Caligula turned into myth. Some called him a demon born of chaos, others a warning from the gods about hubris. In taverns and theatres, he was transformed into a character, half legend, half ghost. Playwrights mocked him on stage, poets turned his cruelty into metaphor, but satire is a form of safety. By turning terror into entertainment, Rome convinced itself it had conquered the memory of fear. It hadn't, it had only renamed it. Every emperor who came after borrowed something from him: the pose of divinity, the spectacle of control, the belief that worship and obedience were the same thing. Caligula's ghost ruled quietly behind their thrones. For the common people, life returned to rhythm, markets, festivals, games. But the air had changed. They had seen what happened when power went unchecked. So they learned to pretend. When emperors spoke, they cheered. When they whispered, they listened. Rome became a city fluent in hypocrisy, fluent in survival. And perhaps that was Caligula's final victory, that his empire learned to wear masks as perfectly as he once did, centuries later. When archaeologists unearthed fragments of his palace, they found things that didn't match the official history. Burned records hidden under marble floors, broken tablets with names scratched out but still faintly visible, pieces of fresco showing ceremonies no one had dared describe. These artifacts didn't just tell the story of one emperor. They told the story of humanity's oldest weakness, the hunger to dominate and the fear to resist. Even the dust carried the scent of submission. What made Caligula terrifying wasn't the scale of his cruelty. History has seen worse. It was how ordinary it became, how easily the extraordinary horror of his rule blended into routine, recorded in ledgers, signed by scribes, enforced by men who thought they were simply doing their jobs. That's why his story endures, not as a tale of madness, but as a mirror. Because every age finds its own Caligulas. They wear different crowns, speak different languages, use different tools, but the machinery is always the same. Control through spectacle, obedience through fear. And the audience, whether in ancient Rome or in any future empire, always learns how to clap on cue. There's a strange justice in how history remembers him. Caligula wanted immortality, and he got it, not through temples or worship, but through infamy. His name survived precisely because it was forbidden. Every time a historian tried to erase him, someone else wrote him down again. Every destroyed statue gave birth to another story. He became the emperor who could not die, not in body, but in memory. And maybe that's fitting. For a man who believed himself divine, eternity came not from heaven, but from history's refusal to forget even now. His shadow stretches far beyond Rome. You can see it in every leader who confuses fear for respect, every institution that prizes obedience over truth, every system that rewards silence more than courage. Caligula may be gone, but the echo of his rule lives in the moments when humanity looks away from cruelty and calls it necessity. His empire was not built on marble, it was built on compromise, on every bowed head that chose safety over defiance. And yet, there is a strange comfort in the ending of his story, because his death, brutal as it was, proved something powerful, that even gods can bleed, that no delusion of power lasts forever. The men who killed him were not saints, but in their rebellion lay the smallest flicker of hope, that tyranny can be broken, even if the world forgets who first struck the blow. Caligula's death didn't free Rome, but it reminded humanity of something older than empire, that no throne, no matter how gilded, is immune to consequence. As the camera of time pulls back, the image of Rome fades into dust. The marble crumbles, the statues fall, the names erode. But the voice of history remains, whispering the same question through the centuries. How much fear are we willing to live with before we call it peace? Caligula's answer was written in blood and silence. Ours is still being written, because every civilization believes it is immune to madness, right up until the moment it crowns it. And when that happens again, as it always does, the ghost of Caligula will be there, smiling in the torchlight, waiting to be remembered. Meanwhile, the Senate tried to maintain the illusion of governance. Decrees were issued that no one enforced, laws written that no one dared interpret. One senator suggested that perhaps the emperor's divinity could be honored through mercy rather than spectacle. The next day, his body was found in the Tiber, throat marked with a single imperial seal ring pressed into the flesh. No one mentioned mercy again. The emperor's moods shifted like storms. He could bless a man with riches in the morning and condemn him to death by nightfall. His guards followed him everywhere, swords always half drawn. Even they had grown hollow-eyed, addicted to the emperor's approval, terrified of his laughter. To them, Caligula was not a ruler. They saw him as a living god who could destroy them with a glance. And that illusion was precisely what kept him untouchable. But even illusions can rot from within. Among the Praetorian Guard, whispers of rebellion spread. Their captain, Cassius Chaerea, had once been mocked publicly by Caligula for his soft voice. The emperor called him Venus, forcing him to salute in feminine gestures during assemblies. What began as humiliation turned to rage. Chaerea began meeting in secret with a few trusted officers. They were not philosophers or heroes. They were men who had served too long and bled too much pride. They didn't dream of saving Rome. They simply wanted the nightmare to end. The plot took shape in shadows. The conspirators knew that Caligula's paranoia made him unpredictable. They could not challenge him openly. They had to wait until he was unguarded, distracted by his own spectacle. Opportunity came sooner than expected. The emperor announced a grand festival to celebrate his union with the gods. He ordered that every senator attend, along with their families, priests, and guards. The ceremony was to take place underground, in a new theatre beneath the palace, a labyrinth of torches, gold, and stone. For Caligula, it would be another performance. For his assassins, it would be his last. The night of the festival, Rome held its breath. The palace blazed with firelight, drums echoing through the marble corridors. Caligula appeared dressed in a golden cloak, claiming he wore the skin of Apollo's radiance. He smiled as he descended into the underground hall, trailed by attendants carrying silver urns of incense. Behind him, the Praetorian Guard formed ranks. The conspirators exchanged brief glances. They had agreed. No hesitation, no mercy. Caligula spoke to the crowd, his voice calm, hypnotic, speaking of destiny, divinity, and the rebirth of Rome. Then, as he turned to step off the dais, Sharia called his name. The emperor paused, amused, ready to deliver another insult. He never finished it. The first blow struck beneath his ribs. Chaos erupted. The air filled with screams and torch smoke. The emperor stumbled backward, blood darkening the gold of his cloak. He looked at his guards in disbelief, as if betrayal itself was a crime against nature. "Do you not understand?" he gasped. "I am immortal." But the next thrust silenced him. When it was over, Caligula lay on the cold marble floor, surrounded by the men who had once sworn to protect him. Dozens of wounds marked his body, as if Rome itself had finally carved its anger into his flesh. Above the palace, the city remained quiet. People waited for an announcement, for the drums to stop. When word spread that the emperor was dead, the silence that followed was not joy, it was exhaustion. Rome had survived its god, but at a cost no one could measure. The Senate convened, hastily, debating whether to restore the Republic or find another ruler. In the end, habit won. They crowned Claudius, Caligula's uncle, as emperor. The cycle continued, polished and renamed, but never broken. For days, workers scrubbed the blood from marble floors. The statues of Caligula were torn down, his name chiseled from stone, his image banned by decree. But memory has a way of defying erasure. Those who had served him could still hear his voice in their sleep. The palace walls retained the echo of his footsteps. Rome learned that tyrants die, but the systems they build often survive them. And as the sun rose over the Tiber, washing the city in gold, no one dared to celebrate. The empire was still vast, still magnificent, but now its heart beat slower, as if wary of what might rise again beneath the marble. The dawn after Caligula's death felt unreal. For years, Rome had been trapped inside the emperor's fever dream, and now, with his body lying cold beneath marble, the city didn't know how to breathe. The palace that had once thundered with the sound of his voice was silent. Even the birds seemed to keep their distance, as if nature itself feared disturbing the corpse of a god. Inside the walls, soldiers moved cautiously, their armor echoing against stone corridors stained with the memory of violence. They expected vengeance from the heavens, a sign that Jupiter would strike them down for daring to kill his chosen son. But the sky remained empty, no lightning, no voice. Just the heavy quiet of disbelief. The conspirators stood in that silence longer than anyone expected. They had ended the man, but not the myth. When Caligula's body was carried through the corridors wrapped in gold-embroidered linen, even his killers avoided meeting his eyes. His face was still twisted in the faint smile of disbelief, the look of someone who could not imagine dying. They buried him in secret, far from public view, because no one could predict what Rome might do with his remains, worship them or destroy them. Rumors spread that the earth itself rejected him, that his grave glowed at night, or that his ghost wandered the palace halls whispering the names of those who had betrayed him. People began leaving offerings at the palace gates, not out of devotion, but fear. The Senate, desperate to reclaim control, declared a damnatio memoria, a condemnation of memory. Every statue, every inscription, every coin bearing Caligula's image was ordered to be destroyed. His name was to vanish from every record as if he had never ruled. Marble busts were smashed to dust, mosaics were torn from floors. Even the walls of the palace were scraped clean where his likeness had been painted. In their minds, erasure was purification. But history is stubborn. It doesn't disappear when ordered. It festers in whispers and nightmares. And for those who had lived through his rule, forgetting was impossible. The survivors carried their scars like invisible brands. The senators who once toasted him could no longer sleep. Every sound of a door creaking in the night felt like his return. The noble families that had bowed to his rituals avoided eye contact in the streets, bound by shared guilt. In the markets, people spoke his name only in riddles. The one who thought himself Jupiter, they would say, as if naming him might bring him back. Rome became a city haunted not by a man, but by the memory of submission. Freedom had returned, yet it felt hollow, like air breath through a wound. In the palace, the cleanup began. Workers moved through halls that still smelled of incense and iron. They scrubbed the marble floors where blood had dried into thin, rust-colored veins. They tore down silk draperies that once hid chambers of terror. Each object they touched seemed cursed with the echo of screams in the archives beneath the palace. Clerks burned scrolls by the thousands, records of rituals, transactions, decrees. The emperor's ledgers, filled with names and crimes, went up in smoke, but not before some scribes secretly copied fragments, afraid that destroying them would only invite repetition. History, they believed, should be remembered, not erased. Meanwhile, the Praetorian Guard, unsure of their future, turned to the one man who could stabilize the chaos, Claudius, Caligula's uncle. He was shy, scholarly, and seen as harmless, which made him perfect. When the guards found him hiding behind a curtain in the palace, trembling, they hailed him emperor. The irony was cruel. The very machine of power that Caligula built, the hierarchy of fear, obedience, and spectacle, was still intact, simply handed to a new master. Claudius inherited not just the throne, but the infrastructure of control. Rome had removed the monster, but kept his cage. Publicly, Claudius condemned his nephew's crimes. He promised reform, justice, and mercy. The people cheered, desperate to believe. But beneath the surface, little changed. The same guards patrolled the streets. The same senators whispered in corridors. The same bureaucrats filed the same reports. The rituals ended, yes, but the habit of obedience did not. Rome had learned to survive through submission, and that lesson would not be unlearned in a single generation. His transformation of Rome's institutions went beyond symbolism. He redefined morality itself. Where previous emperors sought to appear pious, Caligula declared that divinity exempted him from human law. He issued decrees stating that whatever pleased the emperor was, by definition, righteous. The Senate approved each one, their signatures shaking, their consciences dissolving under threat. The emperor was no longer subject to religion. He had become religion. Temples to Jupiter and Mars now included altars to Caligula. Priests changed prayers to include his name. Those who hesitated were erased quietly, their estates absorbed into the treasury, their existence rewritten as if they had never lived at all, but the emperor's appetite for control was insatiable. His next innovation was turning punishment into spectacle. The palace courtyard, once used for triumphal parades, was refitted into a private amphitheatre. There, in the glow of hundreds of torches, Caligula staged public moral trials. He would summon nobles accused of betrayal and force them to defend their virtue before a jeering court of guards and attendants. These were not trials in the legal sense. They were performances meant to entertain his cruelty. Those who spoke too boldly vanished the next morning. Those who grovelled too convincingly were spared only to serve in further humiliations. The audience was compelled to applaud. Each clap was a confession that they had accepted his rule. The emperor began to believe the gods envied his power. He would wander the palace gardens at night, barefoot, muttering to the stars, claiming Jupiter had told him Rome needed to be reborn through pain. Servants sometimes found him standing in the fountains, whispering to his reflection, asking it which one of them was real. The Caligula that had once smiled at cheering crowds was gone, replaced by something hollow and infinite, a man convinced that his madness was prophecy. His cruelty expanded outward, reaching the people beyond the palace. He ordered new taxes disguised as offerings to the divine emperor. Merchants, farmers, and craftsmen were forced to pay tribute for the privilege of being loyal. When provinces complained, he sent statues of himself to be placed in their temples. Those who refused were executed for blasphemy. In Judea, this almost sparked rebellion, but Caligula saw rebellion as confirmation of his godhood. "Only gods are hated this much," he reportedly said with a smile inside Rome. The Senate was suffocating. Each session began with praise for the emperor and ended with fear of his spies. Even the Praetorian Guard, sworn to protect him, began to whisper behind closed doors. They had seen what happened to those who displeased him, officers stripped of rank, families publicly shamed, names erased from records. Yet Caligula's control over them persisted through rewards of gold and terror in equal measure. Every man in uniform wondered which night his name might appear on the emperor's secret lists among the nobles. Stories spread quietly about a ledger kept in a locked chamber beneath the palace, a book said to record every act of disobedience and every favor granted. It was rumored that Caligula read from it during feasts, reciting the crimes of the powerful like verses of scripture. Whether that book truly existed, no one knew, but everyone behaved as if it did. The illusion of surveillance became as powerful as the real thing. People learned to censor their faces, to laugh when he laughed, to weep when he frowned. Rome itself became an actor in his theatre of fear. What made it even more haunting was how normal it began to feel. The empire had grown used to blood. What once would have been unthinkable became routine. Senators compared the emperor's moods like sailors reading the wind. Families prayed not for freedom, but for invisibility. The people, too, adapted. Bread and games continued, gladiators fought. Markets thrived. As long as the spectacle continued, the horrors stayed hidden behind the sound of applause. That was Caligula's genius. He made atrocity look like celebration. One night, during what was meant to be a festival in honor of Jupiter, Caligula unveiled his most twisted proclamation. He announced that he would marry the moon. The priests stood silent, unsure whether to cheer or kneel. He ordered a platform built so high it reached the clouds, and there, surrounded by torches, he raised a silver chalice and vowed eternal union with the goddess of night. The ceremony was absurd, but the message was clear. His power now extended beyond the human world. The Senate applauded until their hands bled, terrified of being the first to stop. In that moment, the emperor's delusion was complete. He no longer ruled Rome, he consumed it. Every law, every ritual, every tradition bent toward his madness like metal drawn to a magnet. Those who still remembered sanity did so in secret, whispering prayers to forgotten gods, hoping for a miracle that would never come. Rome had become a mirror of its emperor, magnificent on the outside, diseased within. And though the torches still burned, their light no longer meant safety. It meant surveillance. The more power Caligula consumed, the more it devoured him in return. Rome had grown used to the theatre of his cruelty, but now the performances began to eat away at the empire itself. The treasury drained faster than gold could be mined. Temples bled silver, and senators whispered that even the gods might soon demand payment. But Caligula had already thought of that. He announced that Rome's faith must fund its divinity. And since he was divine, tribute to him was the same as tribute to the heavens. From every province came shipments of coin, jewels, and tribute disguised as worship. Ships that once carried grain now carried statues of his likeness, carved from ivory and onyx, bound for distant temples he claimed were holy only when they bore his face. The people began to starve, bread grew scarce, prices rose, and still, the emperor's spectacles continued. He built a floating bridge across the Bay of Boia to miles of boats lashed together just so he could gallop across it wearing Alexander the Great's armor, shouting to the crowds that he had conquered the sea itself. When the Senate dared to call it madness, he declared that senators should learn from the waves to bend or break. And from that moment, they all did both. The palace, once echoing with laughter and political debate, became a maze of fear. Servants moved like ghosts, speaking only in whispers. No one knew when the emperor would appear or what mood would rule his mind. One night he ordered the kitchens to prepare a feast for the dead and made senators dine among tombstones in the palace garden, claiming he wanted to see if the dead could eat as well as the living. The next morning, the same guests were forced to sign documents praising his spiritual innovation. Rome's nobility had learned to turn terror into flattery. It wasn't enough. Caligula's hunger for control reached deeper, into the core of identity itself. He began experimenting with people as if they were clay for his amusement. He ordered the sons of noblemen to train as dancers, draped them in golden fabric, and forced them to perform during his private banquets. "Grace," he said, "is proof of loyalty." The young men obeyed, their humiliation recorded by palace scribes who tallied applause like taxes. Those who hesitated disappeared. Rumor spread that their names were quietly carved from family tombs, as if they had never been born. Erasure became the emperor's favorite punishment. To him, death was too merciful, forgetting was forever. Even Rome's architecture began to reflect his mind. New chambers appeared overnight, rooms with no purpose except to echo footsteps. Corridors looped into themselves like madness turned to stone. Walls were lined with mirrors that multiplied his image into infinity. Visitors left dizzy, unsure if they had seen the emperor or a reflection that believed it was him. Caligula began sleeping in different rooms each night, claiming that the gods visited him in dreams and that he must follow where they led. Servants who entered his chambers unannounced were never seen again. The corridors of ancient Rome never truly slept. Beneath the marble arches and gold leaf ceilings, something darker than politics whispered through the air. Every shadow carried a secret. Every torchlight flickered over the trembling face of someone praying not to be noticed. And at the heart of that silence stood a man whose name would one day become a synonym for madness itself. Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, the world remembers him as Caligula. To his soldiers, he was once the charming son of a hero. To his people, he was the promise of a golden age. But to history, he became something else entirely, the emperor who turned desire into a weapon, pleasure into punishment, and Rome into a stage for ritualized humiliation. Before we descend into the world he created, take a breath, because the darkness of Caligula's Rome was not born overnight. It was cultivated, brick by brick, by a man who learned early that love and pain could coexist in the same act. When Caligula first walked the palace halls as emperor, he was radiant, adored by the crowds who hailed him as a savior after the long, paranoid reign of Tiberius. The people shouted his name, women threw garlands at his feet, and senators bowed with a kind of rehearsed devotion they thought would keep them safe. He promised to rebuild what fear had broken. He abolished cruel taxes, freed prisoners, and offered games that filled the streets with celebration. For a moment, it felt as though Rome had found its soul again. But the gods, or perhaps fate itself, had other plans. One autumn evening, the emperor fell gravely ill. For weeks, his body burned with fever so fierce that even the priests doubted he would live. And when he finally opened his eyes, Rome rejoiced, but something inside him had died. Or worse, something new had been born. They said his gaze changed first. His eyes, once warm and alive, now glimmered with something feral, as if he were peering through people rather than at them. He began to speak of divine visions, of voices whispering from Jupiter's temple, of being chosen as more than a man. He declared himself living proof that the line between God and emperor no longer existed. The Senate laughed nervously at first, but laughter soon became impossible. Because Caligula was no longer playing at divinity, he demanded worship. Statues of gods across Rome had their heads removed and replaced with his likeness. Temples once sacred to Jupiter and Venus now bore his name. And inside those temples, a new kind of service began, one that would turn Rome's virtue into his personal stage of control. It started small, hidden behind the grandeur of ritual. Senators' wives were invited to private ceremonies at the palace. Under the pretense of honoring the emperor's divine union with Venus, they came adorned in their finest silks, believing they were to witness a sacred performance. What they found instead were golden rooms lined with incense and mirrors, where the emperor sat like a god upon a throne of ivory. He would summon them one by one, speaking gently at first about purity, loyalty, sacrifice. But soon, the words dissolved into commands. Every movement, every glance, became part of his performance, a spectacle of submission disguised as worship. The husbands, desperate to protect their families, played along, pretending it was all symbolic. But the emperor was never pretending. What began as theatre became policy. Caligula's first atrocity wasn't merely the act itself, it was how he made others complicit. Fathers escorted their daughters to the palace, convincing themselves it was for Rome's glory. Senators toasted him afterward, their smiles stretched over shattered pride. Every violation was recorded as a civic offering, every humiliation justified by divine decree. Rome was learning a new language, one written not in laws but in obedience. It was no longer enough to survive. One had to participate. That was his true invention, not just cruelty, but the machinery to make cruelty ordinary. The palace soon changed form. Its corridors were no longer places of governance, but corridors of selection. Every woman of noble blood was catalogued name, age, appearance, temperament, as if she were part of an imperial inventory. Physicians were assigned to examine them under Caligula's gaze, measuring beauty as though it were currency. Those found worthy were summoned to what he called divine service. Those who resisted were punished through their families. Sons disappeared, fathers disgraced, wealth confiscated. It was a system disguised as sanctity, an empire of ritualized violation operating under the banner of holiness. The emperor's fascination with control extended beyond the physical. He began experimenting with spectacle. Banquets turned into performances where senators were forced to laugh at their own degradation. He would call upon a man's wife, have her seated beside him, whisper something inaudible, and lead her away while the husband smiled through tears, knowing refusal meant death. Hours later, Caligula would return, grin fixed, and comment on her devotion to Rome. Every feast was an execution of dignity. Every cheer in those halls echoed from throats too afraid to close. As his cruelty evolved, it took on a rhythm, a structure that mimicked the bureaucracy of the empire itself. There were scribes to record, guards to escort, and priests to bless. Every act had a number, a record, a date. It wasn't madness. It was method. By reducing horror to paperwork, he made it easier for his empire to digest. A senator might sign a form to approve the divine companionship of his wife, thinking it was symbolic, while knowing deep down what it truly meant. And by the time his pen left the parchment, he was already part of the machinery. What's most haunting isn't that Caligula did these things. It's how easily others accepted them. In a city that once prided itself on law and honor, silence became the highest virtue. Even the poets wrote hymns about his divine touch. The very men who had built Rome into an empire now built excuses for their cowardice. And Caligula, watching from his gilded throne, understood the most terrifying truth of all: power didn't need to be earned if fear could make it sacred. The line between ceremony and cruelty blurred so completely that even those who served the emperor no longer knew which they were witnessing. The palace had become a theater, and every performance demanded an audience. Caligula began hosting what he called nights of divine reflection. Senators and their families were ordered to attend, dressed in pure white as a sign of reverence. They came trembling, because by now they understood that reverence was just another word for submission. Inside, the torchlight was dim and gold, the air thick with resin and fear. The emperor sat at the center, calm, radiant, convinced he was the vessel of Jupiter himself. And in that belief lay the justification for everything that followed. He spoke of purity, of sacrifice, of the need to purge Rome of hypocrisy. Yet what he really meant was obedience. To him, loyalty was not proven by words or deeds, but by how much of one's soul could be surrendered without resistance. The rituals grew stranger with each passing night. Noble families were instructed to reenact scenes from Roman myths, Leda and the Swan, Europa and the Bull. But these reenactments were stripped of poetry, reduced to power displays that reminded everyone who controlled their fate. Every gesture, every symbol was crafted to remind Rome's elite that their bodies, their names, even their honor now belonged to him. Over time, Caligula's fascination with humiliation became structural. He created an office within the palace called the Curators of Virtue, a council tasked with observing and recording moral behavior among the aristocracy. Their reports, written on parchment and sealed with the imperial emblem, determined who was considered loyal and who was not. A single complaint from a curator could ruin a senator's household. Accusations multiplied like rumors in a plague. Husbands accused wives to save themselves. Brothers denounced sisters. Suspicion was rewarded, silence punished. Caligula had discovered something more efficient than fear: the destruction of trust.